And then that's okay. Whether you've been in existence for a long time or just a short period of time, what's been the impact on your business? Uh, First of all, unbudgeted increase in non-program expenses, basically the overhead cost. Insurance falls into that bucket. And so, you know, some insureds have seen increases of, single digits. Others have had double digit. I've seen some increases be 50%, 75, even 100%, which is a shock to the insured. And so it's very difficult sometimes to absorb that. It's even forcing some insureds to choose to be uninsured. In other words, they are dropping coverages, or they realize that they need a certain type of coverage, but they can't afford to purchase it. And so that's another impact that it's had. The third point I have here is that some nonprofits, unfortunately, have to reconsider the programming that they're offering. If they want to start a program that deals with vulnerable adults or children, maybe they can't afford to do that because of the costs associated with the proper insurance needed for that type of exposure. And so you can see how it really does have an impact. And then basically just more pressure to do more with less, as I would say, is the impact that many nonprofits are feeling. What are some examples of the areas where nonprofits find themselves being asked to do more by the insurance company, or making sure that you have certain policies and procedures in place? Abuse and molestation allegations are very scary to underwriters. And so if you have an organization that is dealing with children or vulnerable adults in particular, they need to carry this type of coverage. And in order to get this type of coverage, they have to have very precise policies and procedures in place. They have to be willing to train their employees about how to deal with allegations of abuse and molestation, and be really what I would call buttoned up on it. And so it's just an area where if you do have something go wrong, or even if there's just an allegation of it, it can be very costly and expensive to the nonprofit organization. So another area where we see a lot of activity in terms of claims and underwriting concerns is employment practices liability that has to do with issues between the employee and the employer. When there's allegations of things like wrongful termination, discrimination, which comes in the form of age, gender, race, harassment in the workplace, those types of things. Very common to see a claim like this come across our desk from time to time. Automobiles probably represent the single biggest threat in terms of liability for any organization, whether you're for-profit or not-for-profit. Automobiles cause a lot of damage and lead to a lot of big settlements when they happen, unfortunately. And so there's a lot of risk management and loss control that goes around organizations that have automobiles. Even if you don't have automobiles, and again, we'll get into this a little bit later, you still have some exposure. So we'll talk about that later. Accidents involving your volunteers and your clients are also another area where nonprofits sometimes can get tripped up with regard to claims and how do you handle those claims. So we do provide some counsel and discussion about how to deal with that. Employee dishonesty. Nonprofits, traditionally I've said they overtrust and they understaff. And sometimes as a result, you end up cutting corners unnecessarily when it comes to having the right procedures and controls and mechanisms in place to make sure that the balance and checks are there to prevent someone from taking money or some other asset that may belong to the organization. And then lastly, special events. Special events are interesting. We try to make sure that we include all special events for an organization in their general liability policy, but in some instances, depending on the nature of the special event, you have to go and purchase a separate policy altogether to cover it. For example, if it's a multi-day public access event where there are hundreds or maybe even thousands of people involved, typically won't fit into your day-to-day general liability program. If you have mechanical rides, fireworks, live animals, these things that organizations want to do to entertain the public or their constituents, then you have to think through that. And so that's where, an agent that knows what they're doing can help you sort through all that, figure out the right way to buy the coverage. So, so where do you turn for insurance, for commercial insurance? There are, thankfully today, a number of specialty insurance programs or insurance companies that design their products for nonprofit organizations. Referring back to when I first met Nathan back in 2000 or between 95 and 2000, there were very few companies specialized in nonprofits. And that was one of the challenges, because I remember sitting down with Nathan talking early on, and we said, the one thing that's consistent among all nonprofits is the fact that none of them are alike. If that makes sense. It sounds a little ironic, but even two within the same type of niche, a community action agency, they don't do the exact same thing. They all do something a little bit different. And so as a result, you need to have access to different insurance companies, because some like the exposures and some won't. And so you need to have options to choose from. And again, that's one of the benefits of working with the second point there, an experienced broker, an independent broker, hopefully, because independent brokers have access to multiple companies. We're not a captive broker like a State Farm agent is, or Farm Bureau agent, for example. Nothing wrong with those types of agents, but they only represent their company. A company like Ross & Yerger has access to multiple different companies, so that's an advantage. And then resources. Today, in the year 2024, as compared to the year 2000, there are a lot more resources available that your agent or broker can bring to the table for you. Internet-based tools, seminars like we're doing today. We can help you implement or improve your written policies and procedures that you're required to have. Handbook reviews and contract reviews, just to name a few of the things that we find ourselves consulting our clients on. So a lot of good stuff out there, and you could spend a whole day talking about resources. So advice from the trenches before we get into some of the coverages. This is my best advice to any nonprofit organization, especially one of size. Have a designated risk manager. And it may not be necessarily their title, but have someone who is responsible for your commercial insurance program. It could be your CFO, it could be your controller, or your chief operating officer. Maybe it's the executive director if it's a smaller nonprofit. But have someone who is responsible and is the point person. It makes it easier for the agent or broker who you're working with to deal with that person. It also makes them aware that they are constantly thinking about and being on the lookout for anything risk management related in the organization. Find an agent or broker that you trust and respect. There's a lot of information that goes back and forth. And so you want to make sure that you feel comfortable with whomever you're working with, that they're knowledgeable, that they're trustworthy, and that they're going to represent you in the marketplace when they take your insurance program out for proposals. The next point, screen and train your employees. Many insurance companies require background checks on your employees when you hire them. The best time to do that is prior to hiring them. Make that part of your application process, that you're going to do a background check, and you're on the lookout for things that may show up in a registered sex offenders registry. You're looking at motor vehicle records. You're looking for any financial red flags. But know that there are things that you can do to make sure the people that you're bringing into your organization are going to be working with your constituents are the type of people that you want working there. Training too is very important. Again, I referred back to some resources. There are a lot of tools out there that you can use that most come with no additional cost. You know, it's part of doing business with your agent or broker that they can bring to the table to help train your employees to make them even better and safer from an insurance perspective. Next point, be intentional in identifying risk, meaning, you know, proactively look around and see what may need to be done. For example, if you have exits in your buildings, make sure that they're free access, that they're not boxes in front of the exit doors, that your fire extinguishers are up to date and current, that you don't have any hazardous materials laying around, if you don't have any hazardous items in people's way that are coming in and out of your premises, that type of thing. Implementing written policies and procedures. You know, what I say here is do what you say you do. A lot of times you can adopt a written procedure, but if you just put it on the shelf and don't ever refer to it, then it really is probably not doing you much good. So you need to periodically get those policies and procedures out, review them with your staff, and make sure that everybody's doing what we say we're going to do. Be prepared to answer a lot of questions. As I mentioned earlier, the underwriting process has gotten so stringent and laborious, it sometimes will just wear people down. They're like, why are you asking me so many questions? Well, we're trying to get you the best premium for the limits of insurance that you require, and therefore we need a lot of information to do that. And then lastly, just be willing to change, because the industry, commercial insurance industry, has really become much more stringent, and as a result, our clients are really having to change some of the behaviors that they have in the past. So that's advice. So let me slide into what I refer to as commercial insurance policies needed for most nonprofits, both primary coverages and secondary coverages. Primary meaning the most important basic coverages, secondary meaning coverages that may or may not apply to the organization. So I'll start off with a list, and then I will go specifically into some of the primary coverages and talk about exactly what they are and what they do and how they work. So the first one on the list is general liability insurance. Most people have heard of this. This is sometimes referred to as premises liability, although a true general liability policy will not only cover your premises where you operate, your office, if you will, but also anywhere else that you operate. General liability policies designed to provide limits of coverage that would cover both defense costs and any settlement associated with damages, physical damage, property damage, or bodily injury that is alleged by a third party, meaning not one of your employees, but a third party, your client, someone from the general public. That's what a general liability policy does. It does more than that, but that's in its basic form what it does. The second policy is directors and officers coverage. This is designed to protect the individual assets of your board members, the directors and officers of the corporation. This is oftentimes the very first policy that a startup nonprofit will put into place. I'll get a phone call and they'll say, I'm starting a nonprofit. I might have my tax ID number already, I might not. But as soon as I have it, I need board insurance, is what they say. And this is what they're referring to, the directors and officers liability coverage. That's the first group of people that get together and kind of plan out, what's this nonprofit going to do? What's our mission? And so immediately they have some exposure. The next basic type of coverage is property. And property refers to really any physical asset you can think of. A building, the contents of the building, and other items that may be somewhat mobile. They go on what's called an inland marine policy. I won't get into the weeds of that, but you know, like a lawnmower that's hauled around to cut different properties is a type of inland marine exposure, but it's still property that needs to be insured. Automobiles, pretty self-explanatory. I'll get into auto coverage a little bit later in more detail. But again, that's one of the biggest risks that any business has out there is automobiles. Another basic coverage that every business should have, including nonprofits, is crime or employee dishonesty. Unfortunately, in this world we live in today, people sometimes will just not do the right thing and they will steal from you. And so you have to protect yourself. And in some instances, depending on contractual requirements, if you have federal or state funding or some other mechanisms out there may require that you carry this coverage in order to receive the funding that you need to carry out your mission. Umbrella policies or excess liability policies are also important. They basically just give you extra layers of liability insurance, and we'll speak to that again in a few minutes. And then lastly, under the primary coverages is workers' compensation. And this is always an interesting conversation with nonprofits because sometimes I'll get a call and they'll say, we understand we don't need workers' compensation because we have fewer than 5 employees. And we'll say, well, that may be true, but the question is, who are your employees going to turn to if they're injured on the job while they're working? And so we'll cover that in a little more detail in just a minute. So those are what I refer to as the primary coverages. Let's take a look at the secondary coverages that we often find ourselves in conversation with our insureds about, our nonprofit insureds. First of all, professional liability, also referred to as errors and omissions. If you have employees who provide a professional service of some kind, you need to carry this type of coverage. Professional liability differentiates itself from general liability when you have employees who are specialty trained or designated or certified. The easiest examples to think of are physicians, lawyers, CPAs, insurance agents. We're all licensed or we've been educated with a certain designation or degree, and therefore we're providing a professional service. But it also includes teachers, counselors, all engineers, even some construction exposure is considered to be professional in nature if you're doing design work. And so those fall outside the scope of general liability. And so it's important to talk through with your insurance agent or broker about what your employees are doing, who are your constituents, and what are they getting from your organization, because you'll be surprised how oftentimes it'll slide over from general liability exposure to a professional liability exposure. So that's something to keep in mind. The next item is improper sexual contact or abuse and molestation liability coverage. Again, if your organization has contact or responsibility for children and or vulnerable adults, then you need this type of coverage. And some organizations have varying levels of exposure. Some may have daily direct contact and others may not. It may be periodic. It may be through their volunteers. There are just lots of scenarios to talk through as to whether or not you may need this coverage. The third item listed here is employee benefits and fiduciary liability. Employee benefits liability is oftentimes just an endorsement to the general liability policy, but it's an important endorsement because if your organization offers employee benefits, meaning major medical, life, dental, vision, those types of benefits, and you have potential for administrative errors in the process of offering those benefits, and employee benefits liability would protect you. Fiduciary liability really kind of goes further. It's more in line with the directors and officers' responsibility. They are fiduciaries of those employee benefits. And in particular, if they offer a 403B or a 401k plan, then they really do have a big fiduciary responsibility and the selection of how that's administered and how it's performing over time. And so they would need fiduciary liability coverage for that. Cyber liability coverage is probably the newest product that's come out in the last 10 to 15 years in the commercial insurance world, with the internet becoming very prevalent at the turn of the century. Then, as a over the internet, and basically what cyber liability does is protect the organization in the event that there is a breach of information. And every business has some information just on their employees, what's referred to as personally identifiable information. Name, date of birth, social security number, that type of information. Other organizations have another level of information called protected health information on their potentially their employees, but also their clients or constituents. And that also is a source of information that sometimes someone with ill intent will focus on. Breaches can come from two different areas. They can come from inside the organization, or they can come from outside the organization. Most people think of a breach where you have someone in a foreign country who is trying to hack into your system, as they say, or they get into your system and they basically take it hostage. They call that ransomware. So a cyber liability policy is designed to respond to those types of claims where there could be a significant financial loss, either for your organization itself or a third party who's been affected by a breach of the data that you had about them in your system, if that makes sense. This next product is in fact the newest product that we've seen hit the market just within the last 2 years. It's commonly referred to as active shooter or deadly weapons coverage. And you don't have to go too many days, unfortunately, now and not hear about something. And obviously we were reminded about this past weekend with President Trump and what all went down there. This type of policy would respond to help cover costs associated with an event like that. And you can imagine there's a lot of expense that goes into a situation, unfortunate situation where this happens. Counseling services, public relation consulting and services that need to happen with that. Some things that the traditional insurance policy is not designed to cover. And so many businesses, and now the list has gotten much longer. At first it might be schools and churches where you would think that need this. Well, children's museums and hospitals and any place of business. The U.S. Postal Service was early place where we saw something like this happen decades ago. Unfortunately, there's just nowhere that's guaranteed to be safe these days. So that is a product that is out there and available now. Key person life insurance is also an important policy to consider carrying, especially if you have key employees in your organization. Maybe the executive director, it could be a number of other people, but term life insurance is usually very inexpensive. In particular, if the person's young and healthy, it's dirt cheap. It really doesn't cost much at all. But to have the assurance that if something were to happen and their life is cut short, that there would be some resources there for the organization to be able to use to help take care of the family of that employee that you've lost, to paying headhunters to help you find someone to replace that person. Those funds can be used in a lot of different ways. And so key person life insurance has its place in the portfolio of insurance products. And then lastly, accident policies. Accident policies are, again, very inexpensive policies. Many times they're used to they have a set limit to them. Maybe it's $25,000 to $50,000 to help pay medical expenses. Doesn't have to be any liability associated with it. It's just there to pay medical expenses for people that are injured. Think about your volunteers, your constituents or clients that are involved in activities, even your employees, just to keep it from becoming a workers' comp claim. Accident policies really can come in handy to be first dollar coverage on very short notice. So that's a list of some of the secondary coverages. What I thought I would do now is kind of move into a little more detail about the general liability policy and what it is. Hello, come on in. How are you? That's okay.
Playing musical chairs.
General liability coverage is, as I mentioned, there to protect the organization when a third party alleges bodily injury or property damage. And the policy usually has $1 million limit for any one occurrence and a $2 or $3 million aggregate for the total 12-month policy period. Who is covered by a general liability policy? Generally, anyone working on behalf of the organization, an employee, a volunteer, a director, a committee member, really anybody associated with the organization. You want to make sure the definition of who's an insured is broad enough to cover everybody. It covers, as I mentioned a second ago, bodily injury or physical damage resulting from your operations due to your negligence. And that's an important part of the phrase there, due to your negligence, meaning there has to be some evidence of negligence for it to trigger the policy.
Oh,
Okay. You can't just call them up and say, hey, we owe this person $10,000 because they told us their feelings are hurt. Well, you have to go a little further than that. So there has to be some negligence proven there. Some of the variables that come with a general liability policy that you need to consider. And again, these are appropriate or relevant, I should say, to nonprofit organizations. First of all, host liquor liability. Many businesses, nonprofits included, through some of their social activities or fundraising activities, will provide liquor or alcohol at an event. And you want to make sure that you have a host liquor endorsement on your general liability policy, because it will protect you in the event that someone may come back later and say, well, I was overserved, or I had an accident, it was their fault, et cetera. You really don't need a true liquor liability policy unless you're in the business of manufacturing, distributing, or selling alcohol. And if none of those get triggered when you're a nonprofit. Typically, you're not in the business of making it, you're not selling it, and you're not distributing it. You are, in fact, just giving it free to your patrons. And so that's something to consider. Another variable, again, endorsement, if you will, is the improper sexual contact or abuse and molestation coverage. It can be included in the general liability policy, or sometimes it's sold as a separate policy. It just depends on the nature of the business, the size of the business, and that type of thing. Another thing, a variable to look for in the general liability policy is we don't like to see an off-premises exclusion. Another way of saying that is there's something referred to as a designated premises endorsement, that we just don't like to see that, because the general liability policy should provide protection in your office and then anywhere else you're doing business. Like if you go to a conference center to have a weekend conference, you want to make sure that the alliance is covered there as well as they are within the office.
look, could I?
Yes, please ask
And
the
I
question.
know you all have gone over a lot, but I'm interested in learning about this because I have a project that I'm trying to get off the ground. And it's called Operation Get Out. And it's to help widows or widowers, or let me just say 60 plus age, who have lost their significant others as a result, basically, of COVID. and they're trying to matriculate back into the mainstream of acclimating to doing things normally that they may or may not have depended on their spouse
Right.
to help them with. So I'd like to have high school seniors who have an interest in providing light housekeeping and or lawn care service to help them keep up their yards and keep up just light
Right.
housekeeping, and also have transportation to take them to run errands maybe twice a week.
Right.
So that off-premises exclusion piece,
Yeah, you would want to make sure
I
if
would
you had a
want-
general liability policy, you did not have an endorsement that said you only have coverage at your premises, you know?
and yes,
Right.
and so you're talking about, and then too, I would hope that we wouldn't hire anyone who would take advantage of the elderly, but
Right.
you never know.
Right.
And so, yeah, all of that is.
Yep.
Do you have a copy of those slides to share with us?
We will make them available. You bet.
Oh, okay,
Absolutely.
and then there was another person in there who
Right.
wanted to have them as well. But then I'm really looking at the bottom line. How much would it cost?
Sure,
Be-
sure. That's always the question. That's right. It is. And then the last variable for general liability policies are special events. And again, you try to make sure that all your special events can be included in your general liability policy that you're purchasing. But there are some instances where the special event is so big or so different that you have to have a separate policy altogether for it. So, and usually there's not a deductible associated with the general liability policy. A lot of people ask that. Usually
Oh,
it's no deductible. So directors and officers liability, again, this type of policy is intended to protect the personal assets of directors and officers of corporations, including nonprofits. The covered persons are directors, officers, volunteers, employees, committee members, the full range of people that could be associated with your nonprofit. Incidents covered, any act or decision creating non-physical damages. Again, this is a differentiator from general liability coverage. Examples being pain and suffering, loss of use, improper decisions, mismanagement of funds, et cetera, those types of things. Some of the variables within directors and officers liability, sometimes it's packaged with really this trio of coverages is sometimes referred to as executive liability coverages. It's a three-legged stool. The first leg of the stool is directors and officers. The second can be employment practices liability. Again, this is liability coverage to protect you if there are allegations between the employee and the employer of wrongful termination, discrimination, harassment, those type of things. And the third leg of the stool I referred to earlier as fiduciary liability coverage. If you offer a retirement plan, you are a fiduciary of that plan and need to protect yourself. Another variable to look for on directors and officers and even general liability coverages is if keep in mind that a liability policy does two things. It will pay the defense cost associated with being sued, and it will pay any settlement if you've actually been found of some wrongdoing. Some insurance companies have policies that provide defense costs outside the limit of insurance. So if you have $1 million limit, that full $1 million can be used for the settlement. And the defense cost itself is unlimited, which is really a huge benefit because legal fees can add up very quickly. Sometimes insureds are surprised to see how quickly $1 million limit can be eroded by lots and lots of legal fees, not leaving a whole lot left to pay the settlement, if that makes sense. So it's important to look and see if defense is inside the limit, which means it was shared with the settlement, or outside the limit, which means it's not sharing that limit for settlement coverage. And then lastly, duty to defend. That is language that we like to see because it means that the insurance company has a responsibility or a duty to defend and will will quickly and automatically assign counsel when there is a notice of a claim given to the insurance company on behalf of the insured. If there's not duty to defend, sometimes that means that the insured must take on some of the responsibility to hire their own counsel and or prove that the insurance company should come alongside them and provide the defense sooner than later. Deductibles for directors and officers policies can range from 0 to 5,000 typically for the nonprofits. Some of the smaller nonprofits, it may go up depending on your size. The next area of coverage is property. We talked a little bit about this earlier. What are we talking about when we say property? We're talking about buildings. We're talking about business property. That means office contents, furniture, fixtures, computers, electronic equipment, copy machines, phone systems, etc. And then lastly, business income and extra expense. And that's a phrase not many people are as familiar with, but sometimes it's easier to think of an example like a manufacturing facility. If they have a tornado or a fire and it shuts them down, they're going to have a loss of business income because they can't manufacture their widgets, right? They may also have some extra expense. What extra expense refers to is costs that are above normal operating expenditures. So if it costs a business $30,000 a month to operate or pay rent for some building, and they have a loss and they have to move somewhere else, and it now costs them $40,000 a month. That difference of $10,000 is an extra expense that could be paid for by the insurance company because it's over and above their normal operating expenditures. So that's the difference between business income and extra expense, but typically combined together in one limit, it can be very important, even to a nonprofit organization. So some of the variables, you have to look carefully at a property policy to understand if the insurance company's agreement with you is to pay you replacement cost or if it's to pay you actual cash value. Those are two very different numbers. Replacement cost is pretty much like it sounds. A roof, if you have replacement cost coverage and the roof is damaged, they're going to pay you to replace the roof. If it's actual cash value, the first question after there's damage is they're going to say, well, how old is the roof? Well, the roof is 1 year old. Well, that's pretty much going to be the same number. But if it's 20 years old, then they're going to say, well, the actual cash value is the replacement cost minus all this depreciation is the financial term that comes into play. So replacement cost minus depreciation is equal your cash value. So if you've got a $50,000 roof, but it's 25 years old, don't expect to get $50,000 to replace the roof. You may get something quite less than that. So, and this has really become an issue again, not only with commercial insurance, but also homeowners insurance. A lot has changed in the last few years. Deductibles for property insurance can range from a very low number of $1,000 to $10,000 or more. And in some instances for roofs, even commercial buildings or residential, we've seen a shift to percentage deductibles, which are even much, much higher. Percentage of the total value of the home, if it's 1% or 2%, becomes your roof deductible. And so it's very important to understand that when you have an insurance policy, because if not, you could find yourself in a very precarious position when it comes to what's it going to cost me to get this fixed. So I'll do it on time here. Move a little quicker so we could answer questions at the end. Automobiles. Automobiles are important. If an organization has an automobile that's titled in its name, then they need to have it insured on a commercial auto policy. Even if the organization doesn't own any automobiles, they're probably still using automobiles on behalf of the organization. That would be either someone's personal vehicle who works for the organization or a rented vehicle that somebody's driving. And so a lot of times people say, well, I don't need auto insurance because we don't own any automobiles. I'm like, wait a second. Are you using automobiles for the business? Even if someone's taking a deposit to the bank every day, that is still using an automobile on behalf of the business. And so we have that conversation. Liability is when the vehicle hits something else, causes damage. Physical damage is when something hits the vehicle. A rock, a tree falls on it, you drive into the corner of a building. That's physical damage. Some of the variables, I won't get into the details here, but the difference between looking for symbol 1 and symbol 7 on a policy is important. Symbol 1 means any vehicle you use is covered from a liability standpoint. Symbol 7 means only if the vehicle is listed in the policy. Okay, very important difference. So that's the first thing that we look for when we're reviewing a policy that may be in place. You get medical payments coverage just like you do on your personal auto policy. Uninsured motorist is important. A lot of people drive around us, unfortunately, that don't have any insurance. So if they hit you, they don't have any insurance, you fall back on uninsured motorists. Hired and non-owned, I mentioned that to you a few minutes ago. Hired vehicles are rented vehicles. Non-owned are vehicles that are not owned by the business, meaning someone's personal vehicle. And they also offer hired car physical damage coverage, which can be important. Deductibles typically fall in that range. And I get a question about rental car coverage. I'm going to go rent a car to go to this business conference. Do I need to take the insurance? Yes or no? I get that question a lot. It's hard to answer. Sometimes the credit card that you use will have some benefits associated with it. But here's the deal. There's something called a collision damage waiver that they offer you at the rental car counter, CDW. And it provides physical damage coverage to the vehicle if it's damaged while you're renting it, using it. The rental cars company's interest is they're renting that car to you for $80 a day, right? If there's a wreck and that vehicle is out of use for 2 weeks, that loss of use, 14 days times $80 a day is what they're really losing and what they're most interested in. And that collision damage waiver coverage protects you if you take it. If you don't take it, then you're responsible to cover the loss of use of that vehicle. So just something to keep in mind.
I'm thinking of it this way. If I get the waiver,
Yeah.
or I pay for their insurance,
Yeah,
if the car is total, I get, and I walk away
you
from
walk
it.
away from it. That's
And-
right.
and
You
it's
just hand them
their-
the key.
It's their fish to fry.
That's right.
$14.99 is minimal.
Something like
So
that.
what that
And they
would-
also offer you liability coverage
Yeah.
too, so keep that in mind. But usually if you have hired and non-owned liability coverage, then you're covered already for the business. So just something to think about. Crime and employee dishonesty, we talked about this earlier. Sometimes this is a required coverage from your grantor or other contracts that you may enter. Dishonest acts committed by employees against the employer covers money, securities, and property. If those things are taken.
In
or
my
doesn't.
case, it would be them going into a home and possibly violating.
Yeah, if you had a young person, your employee or volunteer goes into a home and takes something that belongs to them, there's a slightly different coverage there. What this coverage is if one of your young people that was your employee or volunteer took something from you,
Okay.
the employer.
But there's another.
There is. It's something called a business service bond.
Okay.
That people in the caretaking industry need to have that would protect them should there be an allegation that they've taken something that belongs to one of your clients.
Right.
Who's a third party,
Mhm.
if you will. So the subtleties there, but there's coverage available.
Okay.
Some of the controls to make sure that your organizations have in place is separation of duties among people that make deposits, withdrawals, and reconciliation. And again, this goes back to what I said earlier, where unfortunately, especially the smaller nonprofits, you know, you overtrust and understaff. And sometimes on that understaffing, meaning there really is only one person that's doing all of those things. And in a perfect world, you want some separation there, but in reality, sometimes you just can't get it. But these are the kind of questions that insurance underwriters ask before they decide if they can give you coverage or not and what it's going to cost. So counter signatures on checks is also important. If you have a CPA firm do an audit or a review of your financials, it's also very meaningful and important to do. And this is an odd one, but underwriters still ask, do people who are responsible for handling money in an organization take vacations of 5 consecutive days or more? And the reason they ask about that is because that gives sometimes what is otherwise a pattern time to be broken, where you can find an anomaly in the flow of money in an organization. Somebody leaves and they stop doing for 4, 5, 6 days what they had been doing every day to take a little bit here and there. So anyway, that's what that's about. Some of the other coverages that come in this type of policy is protection for forgery and alteration, like a check that's forged, computer fraud and funds transfer fraud, or other things that can happen that lead to the loss of money, as well as social engineering. That's where someone dupes somebody into giving them their username, password, checking account number, routing number, etc., and there's a loss. So blanket versus scheduled. You like to have blanket employee dishonesty where it covers all the employees. Scheduled means, like it sounds, you have certain people listed. Well, you never know who's going to be sometimes. And so you want blanket coverage. Same thing with names and positions. If you have to name a position like the executive director, that's better than having John Doe, because John Doe may leave and Jane Doe may come in as the executive director, and you don't have coverage because it still says John Doe instead of Jane Doe. So little things. Next is umbrella coverage. This is excess liability. Again, this just provides another million up to 10 million more of coverage above the underlying policies that are listed here. The general liability, the auto, the workers' comp, maybe the professional, maybe the improper sexual contact or abuse and molestation coverage. I say maybe because depending on which insurance company it is, they might or might not be willing to provide that excess layer above those two particular coverages. It does not go over the executive liability coverages that I mentioned, doesn't go over cyber typically. So at the bottom, tips, follow form excess versus umbrella. A follow form excess means it'll do exactly what the underlying policy does. What's covered is covered and what's excluded is excluded. An umbrella policy, if you can think of an umbrella that sticks out over the edges, sometimes an umbrella policy will give you some coverage that the underlying policy doesn't give you. And so in that case, there's a self-insured retention somewhere between $0 and $10,000, meaning you pay that amount, but then the umbrella limits will drop down and cover you for whatever's not covered in the underlying policy. So workers' compensation. Workers' compensation in Mississippi, insurance is compulsory in the public sector and compulsory for employers in the private sector who employ 5 or more workers. I've had a lot of nonprofits say, well, I'm a charitable organization. I'm not required to carry workers' compensation insurance. And when you go and look at the workers' comp law, because it's, each state has workers' comp law that kind of dictates how that coverage works. There is language in there that says you are exempt if you have agricultural employees and you're a charitable or you're a charitable organization. It was not really a definition of charitable organization. And so I had a friend that worked at the Workers' Comp Commission. I said, what would your advice be if someone said, I want to be exempt from having to carry workers' comp insurance? And she said, I would have them contact us and get a written letter saying that, yes, you're a charitable organization, you are exempt. Otherwise, you need to carry workers' comp insurance, especially if you have 5 or more employees. And again, it's a sole remedy situation. If your employee is injured on the job, it's much easier just to turn to the workers' comp coverage and say, this will take care of it, as opposed to trying to prove liability, or do they have health insurance, or wherever else they may turn to do it. So it covers full-time and part-time employees, as well as uninsured independent contractors. This is where a lot of organizations get tripped up. You pay W-2 wages to your employees, you pay 1099 to your contractors. If you're hiring a lot of contractors that are 1099, it's in your best interest to make sure that they can prove to you that they have their own workers' comp coverage. Otherwise, when your policy is audited at the end of the year, it's likely to come back and be your responsibility to pay a premium for that exposure, for that 1099 compensation that did not have workers' comp coverage. So again, these are issues that affect some of the larger nonprofit organizations, but it is important to point that out. The benefits under a workers' comp policy are medical benefits, income, meaning lost wages, their death benefits, and also rehab benefits. I know time is slipping by. I wanted to speak for just a second about employee benefit coverages and kind of the state of the market there. It's a stable market for employee benefits, including health insurance or major medical coverage right now. There are really 3 solutions for Mississippi-based businesses to have a group health insurance or major medical plan: Blue Cross Blue Shield of Mississippi, United Healthcare, or the Health Insurance Exchange for individuals that may qualify for subsidies there. That's from the Affordable Care Act that passed. The cost drivers for health insurance in particular are twofold: medical inflation, meaning if the cost of healthcare goes up, then the cost of health insurance goes up with it. I think everybody understands that. And then prescription drugs is probably the single biggest driver of increase in the cost of your health insurance or major medical coverage today than anything else. It used to be about 20% of the total cost of healthcare, and now it's getting closer and on its way to being 50% or more. And all you have to do is turn on your television late in the afternoon and you'll understand why. Because consumers are being bombarded with advertisements, and those drugs are super expensive, super expensive.
Not a whole
And so,
approved.
yeah, and so, and some are being used for lots of things. We won't go into that, but,
So in that case, Fire, just
Yeah.
the increase in prescription, the percentage of insurance, the cost of insurance increasing related to prescription drugs is driven by the increased price of prescription drugs and the increased uptake and
the use, that's right.
both at the same time.
Yep. That's right. We met with one of our larger self-funded employee benefit clients yesterday, and they have 3,000 employees.
Okay.
But 16 people on the plan are driving like 70% of the prescription drug cost, if you can believe that. The
Yeah.
specialty drugs are so very expensive. And of all the drugs in their plan, 90% of them are generic, but that 10% that are brand and those specialty drugs are so very expensive that it's really something. Some of the other products that we offer on a group basis, meaning 5 or more employees, besides major medical, or life, dental, vision, disability. That would be long-term disability, short-term disability. Voluntary products, think about Aflac You know, they offer a cancer policy, hospital indemnification, critical illness, those type products. We offer benefit administration systems, a Ben admin system. If you have a large number of employees and you want to automate how all that's managed and have a payroll integrated into it, that's a good tool to use. And then we also offer 401k and 403b plans for retirement savings for the employees, which is a great benefit to offer. So that is the end. Went a few minutes over. I know we started a few minutes late, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to entertain them.
I asked my questions. I'm really interested in the service bond because it directly relates to the services I want to provide. So,
Right.
do you have any information on that?
Yeah, we can
That you can
get
share?
together offline.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay,
Yep.
sure.
Anyone on the call have any questions y'all want to chime in? We can't see the chat, so y'all just come off mute and feel free to ask.
I may have put everybody to sleep.
No, I don't.
I'm not
think they're
insurance.
ready to sleep.
Pretty boring topic, but
Very interesting to me. I'm sorry I couldn't be here on the onset of
I'm gonna steal my last business card that Michael had and
Okay.
let you have it. And then
Okay,
you
and so I can just give you a call.
Yeah.
My name is Sylvia Turner.
Hey, Sylvia.
That's nice to
Dudley.
meet you. Okay, and so I will be calling you.
Okay,
I'm gonna flip gears here. Go
Okay.
back over to my framing,
great.
but nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
And you're gonna get us some.
Yes, I'll email it out to y'all.
Okay.
All right, for those of y'all on the call, I don't see any questions. So what we'll do afterward, I'll send out this PowerPoint to those of you who are in attendance so that you can review it at your leisure and take a look. And if you have questions, if things do come up as you're thinking through the information you've heard today, or as you're going back to the PowerPoint, you can just send them either to me, or if you have Dudley's contact information, you're welcome to send them that way. But we'll get those questions answered regardless. That's the point I mean to make. Other than that, I think we've covered everything. So we can break for lunch, let everyone go off and finish the rest of their day. So I appreciate y'all. Thank y'all for being here today. Look out for, we'll be highlighting this member benefit in our August issue of the Ally. So again, if you want some more information on this, there will be a write-up with more information there as well. So I hope everyone has a good day, and we will see y'all in about a month at our next webinar.
Thank you.